Good afternoon, students. Welcome to the Week 5 and Week 6 wrap-up. So now we end the poetry unit. And poetry is fun for everybody because research shows that if you write poetry, it helps to alleviate wintertime depression, because poetry is a form of literature where you express your emotions to the world. And in a few short words, like in a haiku, you can describe, the beauty of nature, or you can describe or express any kind of emotion ranging from love, despair, hate, any kind of experience, any kind of longing. And so poetry is the highest form of literature. It shows different shades of human beings. Poetry expresses different feelings such as friendship, love, death, and other emotions. Poetry matters because it reveals truths about ourselves. It enables humans to focus and problem solve. It inspires creativity, and poetry acts as a catalyst for overcoming fears. Poetry allows us to see emotional detail at the macro and micro level. And so when we studied Shakespeare's sonnets in Week 5, we discovered that love is eternal. When we read William Blake's The Poison Tree, we realized that if we let our anger fester and we don't talk about it and air it out, it can explode into such violence that you would want to see your neighbor or your enemy under the tree not alive anymore. So, and then of course you've got The Last Duchess, by Browning, where the Duke of Ferrara, at least that's the reputed, according to the rumors, killed his wife, the Duchess of Ferrara, for being too happy. And so for being too positive and happy and flirtatious. And he showed, so in that poem you see jealousy, controlling, and abuse. And then in My Papa's Waltz by Rothke, you see a poem where a small child dances with his father, and you see a poem that can be interpreted in many different ways. Either you see it as child abuse, or you see it as a happy memory of a father and a child together. So that's an example of what we bring to the different interpretations that we bring to whatever we read based on our own life experiences. And so poetry acts as a catalyst for us to overcome our fears. It helps us admire the emotions in others. And it also makes us realize that our emotions of fear and longing, love, hate, despair, when we think we're alone in feeling these feelings, or odd for feeling these feelings, we realize that these feelings are universal. In the poem of The Love Song of Alfred Prufrock, as I mentioned in my lecture, you see an aging old man who's insecure about his looks, and he thinks that because of his bald head he won't attract females anymore. So there you see an example of social anxiety, panic attack, and just simply insecurity. So all kinds of emotions can be expressed in poetry. And that's what they mean by seeing emotional detail on a macro and micro level. For me, I love reading the Shakespeare sonnet where they talked about how love can be eternal, and no matter how much time changes the circumstances, love stays constant. And I think that's why people still read Shakespeare's sonnets to their loved ones. And in the old days, like I said in my other lecture, in Europe and in America, people used to read Shakespeare's sonnets in order to get the other person to want to go out with them, or in order to get the other person to fall in love with them. Most importantly, poetry reading and poetry writing, just like prose, helps people discover who they are. And so poetry helps us discover not only who we are, but also who others are. And it also allows us, like prose, to see through the window of other people's thoughts, and for us to discover that we are not alone in our emotions, and that, as I said before, that it's all universal. And poetry keeps us in tune with our thoughts and our emotions. There's a lot more, huh? Poetry is a great way to ask questions and incorporate a diversity of voices, and also helps us realize the many different ways of thinking about emotion. That's what poetry is for. It can for instance, and another thing that poetry can do is poetry can mobilize a nation into action. For example, with Martin Luther King, he wrote I Have a Dream, and he incorporated a lot of poetic devices into I Have a Dream speech. He incorporated alliteration, he incorporated repetition of theme, he incorporated metaphors, he incorporated, if I were to go over line by line, I Have a Dream, I will find the assonance, alliteration, all the different poetic devices that make a poem so beautiful to listen to. Martin Luther King interspersed these same poetic devices into his I Have a Dream speech. So next time you read I Have a Dream, listen for those poetic devices, and then you'll realize that is part of what makes I Have a Dream such an unforgettable speech, because Martin Luther King was a natural-born poet, even though as far as I know, he didn't write any poetry books, but his speeches has the beauty of the most classic of the poetry that we've read in this class so far. And so poetry, or poetic devices, can also galvanize a nation into action. And for Martin Luther King brought social awareness of racism to the U.S., to the American consciousness. And so poetry can also galvanize a nation, as I said, into action, and can also address social injustices. So through reading and writing poetry, a person can find out more about their personality, their likes and dislikes, and interests. And in week 6, we also learned that poetry has musical elements that I mentioned in my week 7 or week 6 lecture, and that these musical elements is what lends such beauty to the poetry. So the poem Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll has a lot of nonsense words, but it's not so much what the words mean. In this case, in Jabberwocky, it's how the words sound when read together. They have such a beautiful musical sound to it. And so that's why, and many poets have experimented using different forms of poetry, and I think I mentioned all of this in my lecture, so I'm going to keep this really short because I run the danger of repeating what I've already said in my previous lecture. So poetry is a great way to analyze and understand who we are through our emotions, as I said before. So I want to keep the wrap-ups very general, very tight, and as concise as possible. So in conclusion, poetry can increase empathy in others, just like with prose. Poetry helps us pass down memories, promote political change, help us heal, and empower us to see the world with fresh eyes. As we end week 6, we finish our short foray into poetry, and next week, week 7 and 8, we are going to go into cinema, theater, and the movies. So I'll see you all at the movies and at the theater for our next lesson. So if you have any questions about anything in this class, feel free to email me.